August 17th, 1944, 11:43 at night. The sky over western Montana glowed orange, not with sunset, which had faded hours ago, but with something far more dangerous. From the window of the guard tower at Camp Riverside POW facility, Corporal James Mitchell could see the fire advancing down the ridge 3 miles west. It moved like a living thing, consuming the drought-dried ponderosa pines with a sound like distant artillery, throwing embers a quarter-mile ahead of the main flame front. The wind had shifted at 10 p.m. The fire that had been burning harmlessly in the Lolo National Forest for 4 days, monitored but not threatening, was now racing directly toward the camp, toward the wooden barracks that housed 380 Japanese prisoners of war, toward the ammunition depot 2 miles south, toward the town of Missoula itself, population 22,000, sleeping in the valley below. Mitchell was 23 years old, from Ohio, medically discharged from combat duty after taking shrapnel in his left leg at Guadalcanal. He'd been assigned to guard duty at this POW camp, thinking it would be boring, safe, a way to finish his service without further danger while recovering from the nightmares of the Pacific. He'd been wrong. The fire was coming, fast, and the camp had exactly 19 American guards to evacuate 380 Japanese prisoners, men Mitchell had been taught to hate, men whose comrades had killed his best friend on a beach in the Solomon Islands. The math didn't work, but more than that, every instinct screamed at him to save the guards first, to leave the prisoners locked in their barracks, to let the enemy burn. And yet, James William Mitchell had killed 3 Japanese soldiers. He remembered their faces. Born in 1921 in Dayton, Ohio, he'd been the youngest of 4 children in a family that ran a small hardware store. He'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, burning with rage at what he'd seen in the newsreels, the burning ships, the dead sailors, the Japanese bombers. He'd been assigned to the 1st Marine Division, trained at Camp Pendleton, and shipped to Guadalcanal in August 1942. He'd been 19 years old, convinced he was fighting demons in human form. The propaganda had been clear. The Japanese were subhuman, fanatic, incapable of reason or mercy. Then he'd fought them for 6 months in the jungles of the Solomon Islands. The first man he'd killed had been at Henderson Field. A Japanese soldier, couldn't have been more than 20, had charged his position during a banzai attack. Mitchell had fired his M1 Garand, hit him center mass. The soldier had fallen 10 feet away, close enough that Mitchell could see his face, could see the terror there, identical to his own. The second and third had been during patrol actions, quick firefights, bodies that stayed with him when he closed his eyes. And then came the day that changed everything. February 1943, during the final push to clear the island, Mitchell's squad had cornered 3 Japanese soldiers in a cave. Standard procedure was grenades, seal the cave, move on. But Private Danny Kowalski, Mitchell's best friend since training, had shouted for them to surrender first. Required by regulations, Danny had said. Give them a chance. The Japanese soldiers had emerged with hands raised, emaciated, terrified, barely able to stand. They'd been surrendered to the rear for processing. 2 days later, Danny stepped on a landmine. Mitchell had held him while he bled out, had listened to him cry for his mother, had been covered in his friend's blood when Danny died. Mitchell should have hated the Japanese more after that, should have blamed them all for Danny's death. Instead, he'd found himself unable to stop thinking about those 3 prisoners in the cave. How young they'd looked, how scared, how human. The shrapnel had hit him in March 1943 during a mortar attack. He'd been lucky, painful wound, permanent limp, but no vital organs hit. They'd shipped him stateside, given him medical discharge or guard duty options. He'd chosen guard duty partly because he couldn't go home yet, couldn't face his mother and pretend he was fine, but also because something in him needed to understand, needed to see Japanese soldiers in a context other than combat, needed to know if they were the demons from propaganda or the terrified boys from the cave. Camp Riverside had been established in July 1944 as an experiment, a small facility outside Missoula, designed specifically for Japanese POWs who'd been evaluated as cooperative, mostly Nisei soldiers who'd been conscripted, or captured soldiers who'd expressed willingness to work. The Army wanted to test whether Japanese prisoners could be used for labor, like their German counterparts, or whether racial tensions would make it impossible. Mitchell had arrived in May, one of 19 guards assigned to 380 prisoners. He'd expected monsters. He'd been prepared for hatred, resistance, the fanaticism he'd been taught to expect. Instead, he'd found men who bowed when guards entered rooms, who worked quietly in the agricultural crews, who maintained meticulous discipline in their barracks, who seemed as confused about the war as Mitchell was. There was Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto, the senior prisoner NCO, a 32-year-old from Hiroshima who'd been a schoolteacher before conscription. He maintained order among the prisoners with quiet authority, treated the guards with wary respect, and had been captured on Saipan after being separated from his unit. There was Private Taro Nakamura, 19 years old, who'd been conscripted from a farming village and captured on Guam after 3 weeks of combat. He spoke almost no English, but was obsessed with learning, carried a pocket dictionary everywhere, practiced words with guards during work breaks. There was Corporal Hideo Tanaka, a combat engineer who'd built fortifications across the Pacific, been captured on Tarawa after his bunker collapsed from naval bombardment. He had burns on 40% of his body, was recovering slowly in the camp hospital, and spent his days sketching architectural drawings of buildings he'd never construct. Mitchell had learned their names, their stories, had started seeing them as individuals rather than the faceless enemy. And now they were going to burn. The summer of 1944 was a complicated moment in American racial consciousness. The war against Germany was seen, at least officially, as a war against Nazism, against an ideology. Individual German soldiers could be separated from their regime, could be treated with Geneva Convention decency. The war against Japan was different. It was racial. The propaganda didn't distinguish between Japanese military and Japanese people. Jap wasn't just shorthand. It was dehumanization. Cartoons showed Japanese as apes, rats, insects, something less than human that needed to be exterminated. On the American home front, 120,000 Japanese Americans, citizens, many born in the U.S., had been imprisoned in internment camps, not for what they'd done, but for who they were. The fear and hatred of anything Japanese was endemic, accepted, official policy. In this context, Camp Riverside was radical. The very idea that Japanese POWs could be trusted to work, could interact with American civilians, could be treated as human beings rather than as threats, was controversial. When the camp opened, local newspapers had run editorials questioning whether housing enemy Japanese so close to an American town was safe. Several families had protested, but Montana needed labor. The war had drained farms of workers, sugar beet crops, wheat harvests, timber operations, all were understaffed. German and Italian POWs had proven useful and reliable. The military wanted to know if Japanese POWs could do the same. Camp Riverside was the test case. The prisoners worked 6 days a week on local farms and in timber operations. They were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip. They were housed in wooden barracks with bunks, basic heating, adequate food by POW standards, though not by American civilian standards. They received mail through Red Cross channels, could write censored letters home, had access to a small library of Japanese books. They were treated, by military standards, well. Better than Japanese forces treated Allied POWs. Better than Japanese Americans were being treated in internment camps. But they were still the enemy. Still the face of an enemy that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that fought with fanatical determination, that American soldiers had been taught to kill without mercy. The guards at Camp Riverside occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. They were supposed to maintain security, enforce discipline, prevent escape. But they were also responsible for prisoner welfare, for ensuring Geneva Convention standards, for managing work details that required basic cooperation. Most guards dealt with this by maintaining professional distance. The prisoners were Japs, collectively, numbers rather than names, a job rather than people. Mitchell had tried that approach for 2 weeks. It hadn't worked. He couldn't stop seeing faces. By August, he'd settled into an uneasy pattern, professional but not cruel, distant but not dehumanizing, prepared to shoot if necessary, but hoping it never would be necessary. He'd thought that was the hardest ethical balance he'd have to maintain. Then came the fire. August 17th, 1944. 11:50 p.m. Major Robert Thornton, camp commander, stood in the administration building with a map spread across his desk and a telephone receiver pressed to his ear. He was 46 years old, a career officer who'd been wounded at Bataan and evacuated before the death march. He'd spent 18 months recovering from malaria and dysentery, had been assigned stateside duty as a mercy from the Army that recognized he'd already given enough. "Say that again," he said into the phone, his voice tight. The Forest Service supervisor on the other end repeated what he'd already said. The fire was moving at 4 to 5 miles per hour, wind-driven, unstoppable. It would reach Camp Riverside in approximately 45 minutes. Evacuation was the only option. Thornton hung up and looked at his assembled staff. 4 officers, 15 enlisted guards, 19 men total to manage an emergency evacuation of 380 prisoners. Transportation, he asked his executive officer, Lieutenant Barnes. 2 trucks, 1 bus. We can move maybe 70 prisoners per trip to the safe zone in Missoula. That's 8 trips minimum. At 30 minutes per round trip, that's 4 hours. We have 45 minutes. Silence. We can prioritize guards and essential personnel first, Barnes said carefully. Get our people out, then make as many prisoner trips as possible. Thornton looked at the map, at the fire's projected path, at the math that didn't work. So we evacuate maybe 200 prisoners if we're lucky. The other 180 stay in the barracks and burn. Sir, they're enemy combatants. Our priority has to be American personnel. They're prisoners of war under our custody. We're responsible for their safety, under Geneva Convention. Sir, with respect, Geneva Convention doesn't require us to die protecting them. If it's a choice between our men and theirs, it's not a choice yet. There has to be another option. But there wasn't. Thornton knew it. The vehicles were insufficient. The time was insufficient. The fire was coming. That's when Corporal Mitchell knocked on the door. Sir, I have a suggestion. You're not going to like it. Mitchell laid out the proposal in 2 minutes. Use the prisoners to fight the fire. Create a firebreak on the western perimeter, 300 feet wide, cleared of all combustible material. It wouldn't stop the fire completely, but it might slow it enough to buy time for full evacuation. You want me to arm 380 Japanese POWs with axes and shovels and trust them not to escape or attack us? Thornton's voice was incredulous. Sir, where are they going to escape to? We're 60 miles from the nearest town. And right now, the only thing between them and burning to death is that firebreak. They have more incentive to build it than we do. The racial situation. You know how local civilians feel about Japanese prisoners. If word gets out that we armed them. Sir, if word gets out that we left 180 prisoners locked in barracks to burn alive because we couldn't evacuate them in time, that's worse. Lieutenant Barnes spoke up. Corporal, you fought in the Pacific. You know what they did at Bataan, what they did to our POWs, and you want to give them tools that could be used as weapons? Mitchell met his eyes. Sir, I know what happened at Bataan. I know what we're fighting against. But I also know that if we let prisoners burn because we're afraid of them, we become what we're supposed to be better than. Thornton was silent for a long moment. Then, get Sergeant Yamamoto. I want to talk to the senior prisoner directly. Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto was brought to the administration building at 12:05 a.m. He was a slight man, 5 feet 5 inches tall, with the thin frame of someone who'd been underfed for 2 years. He bowed formally when he entered, then stood at attention. Major Thornton dismissed the guards except for Mitchell. Then he spoke directly. Sergeant Yamamoto, do you understand the situation? Yes, Major. Forest fire approaching camp. Evacuation needed. We don't have enough vehicles to evacuate everyone in time. Some prisoners will be left behind unless we stop or slow the fire. Corporal Mitchell suggests we use prisoner labor to create a defensive firebreak. You would be given tools, axes, shovels, saws. You would work under guard supervision to clear land on the western perimeter. If this works, everyone lives. If it fails, or if prisoners use the chaos to escape or attack guards, people die. Do you understand? Yamamoto stood perfectly still. Then, may I speak freely, Major? Please. My men are prisoners. We have been defeated. In Japanese culture, this is deep shame. Many of my men struggle with this shame every day. They are alive when they should be dead by military code. Some wish they had died in battle. Some are grateful to be alive, but ashamed of that gratitude. I don't see how this relates. If you give us this task, you give us something more valuable than life. You give us purpose. You give us chance to save lives instead of take them. You give us honorable action. My men will work. They will not escape. They will not attack. Because for first time since surrender, we will be useful instead of burdensome. Thornton studied him. You can speak for all 380 men? No, I cannot speak for all. There are some who are difficult, bitter, angry. But most will work, and I will personally ensure the difficult ones do not interfere. If any prisoner attempts escape or violence, this arrangement ends immediately. You understand? Yes, Major. If this goes wrong, the consequences will be severe, not just for the prisoners who act out, but for all Japanese POWs in American custody. This camp is being watched as an experiment. If Japanese prisoners prove untrustworthy, it confirms every racist assumption about your people. You understand that? Yamamoto's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Yes, Major. I understand we must be better than German prisoners to be considered equal. We must be perfect to be seen as adequate. This is not fair. But this is reality. Can your men build a fire break in 40 minutes? If we are organized and motivated, yes. Japanese military emphasizes engineering and construction. Many of my men have experience. Give us tools and clear instructions. We will build your fire break. Thornton looked at Mitchell, then back at Yamamoto. Corporal Mitchell will coordinate with you. Any prisoner who doesn't follow orders immediately, any sign of hesitation or resistance, gets locked in barracks. Clear? Clear, Major. Then wake your men. You have 35 minutes. August 18th, 1944, 12:15 a.m. The alarm sounded across Camp Riverside. 3 sharp blasts from the hand-cranked siren. Prisoners emerged from barracks, in various states of dress, some in full uniform, some in sleeping clothes. The guards had expected confusion, panic, chaos. Instead, they found military discipline. Within 3 minutes, 380 Japanese prisoners stood in formation in the central compound, organized by barracks, silent and waiting. Sergeant Yamamoto addressed them in Japanese. Mitchell understood maybe 10 words. Fire, work, honor, together. But he understood the effect. The prisoners' postures changed. Backs straightened, heads lifted. Something that had been defeated became purposeful. Yamamoto switched to English. Major Thornton has authorized us to fight fire. We will build firebreak on western perimeter. This is dangerous work. This is voluntary. Any man who does not wish to participate may return to barracks and wait for evacuation. No shame. No punishment. You have 10 seconds to decide. No one moved. Then we work. Follow Corporal Mitchell and guard team to tool shed. Each barracks unit will receive assignments. We have 30 minutes. We will not fail. The tool shed was unlocked. Inside, 40 axes, 60 shovels, 20 handsaws, 30 pickaxes. Weapons, essentially. Tools that could kill if turned against guards. Mitchell watched as Yamamoto distributed them with military efficiency. Each prisoner received a tool appropriate to his size and strength. Each barracks unit received a balanced complement of equipment. It was organized, professional, and slightly terrifying. "All right," Mitchell said, his voice carrying across the assembled prisoners. "Western perimeter, 300 feet back from the current tree line. We're going to strip that land bare. No trees, no brush, no grass. Dig down to mineral soil. Create a barrier the fire can't cross. Sergeant Yamamoto will assign sectors. Guards will supervise and assist. Questions?" A hand went up. Private Nakamura, the 19-year-old with the pocket dictionary. He spoke in halting English. "If fire comes before finish, what do?" "Then we run like hell and hope we're fast enough. But we're not going to let it come to that. Move out." The prisoners moved to the western perimeter in organized units. Mitchell watched them work with growing amazement. This wasn't the chaos of desperate men. This was military engineering executed with precision. Yamamoto had organized them into specialized teams. Axemen to fell small trees, saw teams for larger ones, diggers to remove stumps and roots, brush clearers to remove undergrowth, quality control teams to ensure the firebreak met specifications. Corporal Tanaka, the combat engineer, moved between teams providing technical guidance despite his burns. Angle trees away from camp, remove roots completely. Fire travels underground through root systems. Firebreak must be continuous, no gaps. Speed is important, but completeness is critical. The night air filled with the sound of axes biting into wood, saws cutting through trunk, shovels striking soil. The prisoners worked with intensity that bordered on desperation, not the desperation of fear, but of men who'd been given purpose after months of meaninglessness. Mitchell moved among the teams, checking progress, redistributing workers to bottlenecks. His leg throbbed, but he ignored it. Several guards had joined the work, grabbing tools and helping dig. The distinction between guard and prisoner blurred in the darkness and urgency. At 12:35 a.m., the fire crested the ridge. For the first time, everyone saw it clearly. A wall of flame easily 200 feet high, consuming the forest with terrifying speed. The heat hit like a physical wave, even from 2 miles away. Several prisoners paused, staring at what was coming for them. "Keep working," Yamamoto shouted in Japanese, then English. "Fire will not wait for fear. Work." They worked. At 12:45 a.m., embers began falling like snow. Small spot fires erupted in the camp itself, on roofs, in grass, near the storage buildings. "Roving teams," Tanaka shouted. 30 men. Break from fire break. Patrol camp. Extinguish spot fires before they spread. Without waiting for guard approval, 30 prisoners peeled off from the fire break work and began patrolling the campgrounds with buckets of water from the fire barrels positioned throughout the facility. They moved systematically, working in pairs, extinguishing each ember within seconds of it landing. Mitchell watched a prisoner, whose name he didn't know, throw himself onto a burning ember that had landed near the ammunition depot, used his own body to smother it. Other prisoners beat out the flames on his clothing, dragged him to safety, sent him to the medical station, and immediately resumed patrol. No orders given, no approval sought, just action. At 1:05 a.m., Major Thornton appeared at the fire break. "How much longer?" 10 minutes, sir," Mitchell reported. "The main break is nearly complete. We need to finish the northern section. The fire will be here in 8 minutes. Then we work faster." Thornton looked at the organized chaos before him. American guards and Japanese prisoners working side by side, all of them covered in soot, all of them focused on the same desperate goal. "Corporal, when this is over, I'm either getting court-martialed or commended. I'm not sure which." "If it works, sir, I don't think anyone will care which." At 1:13 a.m., Sergeant Yamamoto shouted something in Japanese. All prisoners stopped, stepped back from the fire break, and looked at their work. A 300-foot-wide strip of bare earth, stretching from one end of the camp's western boundary to the other. No trees, no brush, no fuel for the fire. "It's done, Major," Mitchell said. "Get everyone back from the perimeter, 60 feet minimum. If the heat gets too intense, full retreat to the evacuation vehicles." The prisoners and guards fell back to a safe distance and waited. At 1:17 a.m., the fire reached the fire break. What happened next would be analyzed and debated for decades. Fire behavior specialists would later call it improbable, but not impossible. Military historians would call it a fortunate confluence of factors. The men who were there would call it something else, earned. The fire hit the southern end of the fire break, like a freight train hitting a wall. Flames surged forward, reached bare earth, and had nothing left to burn. The fire's leading edge stopped. But fire has momentum. Superheated air continued forward, igniting spot fires on the campsite of the break. The roving teams attacked each one within seconds. Some fires took hold anyway. Prisoners threw themselves at those fires with a desperation that transcended self-preservation. Private Nakamura, the 19-year-old who'd asked what to do if the fire came, used his body to shield a burning building, standing in front of flames that singed his hair while other prisoners threw water. The building was saved. Nakamura was treated for minor burns and went right back to patrol. The main fire tried to flank the fire break, moving north along its edge. But the break extended the full length of the camp's western boundary. The fire had nowhere to go except around, which would take time. Time the evacuation vehicles could use. At 1:45 a.m., the first truck loaded with 70 prisoners, those most injured from the firefighting effort, those with chronic medical conditions, departed for Missoula. The fire was still burning, still dangerous, but no longer an immediate threat to the camp. At 2:10 a.m., the wind shifted, not back west, that would have been disaster, but north, parallel to the fire break. The fire, which had been trying to flank the camp, suddenly followed the wind direction away from the facility and into unpopulated forest. The crisis was over. August 18, 1944. 3:30 a.m. Corporal Mitchell sat on the ground near what remained of the administration building. The roof had caught fire from embers, been saved by a bucket brigade, but was heavily damaged. He was too exhausted to stand, too wired from adrenaline to sleep. Around him, Japanese prisoners collapsed where they stood. No one had escaped, not one. Despite having been armed with tools that could have been weapons, despite having been given freedom of movement during the chaos, despite having every opportunity and justification to run, they'd stayed, and they'd saved the camp. Sergeant Yamamoto approached and stood beside Mitchell. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Yamamoto said quietly, "I must ask, you fought in Pacific, yes? You're limp. Combat injury? Guadalcanal. Shrapnel from mortar. I am sorry. War is a terrible thing." "Yeah, it is." Mitchell looked up at him. "Why didn't any of your men run? You had the chance." Yamamoto was quiet for a moment. "Where would we run? Into burning forest? Into American countryside that sees us as enemy? We are prisoners, Corporal. But tonight, for a few hours, we were not prisoners. We were men doing important work. Men whose skills mattered. Men who saved lives instead of taking them. That is worth more than freedom to run nowhere. A lot of people won't understand that. They'll say we were stupid to trust you. Perhaps. But you trusted us when you had no reason except desperation and hope. That is worth remembering." Major Thornton appeared, exhausted but upright. "Sergeant Yamamoto, I need a full count of prisoners." Yamamoto stood at attention and saluted. 380 prisoners accounted for, Major. No escapes. 42 men injured, all non-critical. 27 cases of minor burns. 15 cases of smoke inhalation. 3 broken bones from falling debris, all receiving medical treatment. Work completion. Firebreak fully operational. 320 feet average width, continuous from southern to northern boundary. And the camp facilities? Administration building roof, 60% destroyed, but structure intact. Barracks 3 and 7 with minor fire damage, fully repairable. Storage buildings intact. Ammunition depot intact. Medical station intact. Overall damage minimal. Thornton nodded slowly. "Sergeant, you and your men saved this camp. You understand that?" "We saved ourselves, Major. You allowed us to do so. That is gift. We will not forget. I'm going to have to write a report explaining why I armed 380 Japanese POWs and turned them loose during an emergency. The Army's going to have questions." For the first time, Yamamoto almost smiled. "Perhaps tell them we were more afraid of fire than of freedom," is truth. The official report filed by Major Robert Thornton on August 19, 1944, was carefully worded. During wildfire emergency of 17-18, August 1944, prisoner labor was utilized under close guard supervision to construct defensive firebreak. Operation succeeded in protecting camp facilities. No escape attempts, no hostile actions. 42 prisoners injured while performing assigned duties. Recommend commendation for prisoner cooperation and exemplary behavior under emergency conditions. What the report didn't mention: the moment when Private Nakamura had used his own body to shield a building from flames. The SS. No, that was Germans. The moment when Corporal Tanaka had organized teams with the precision of a military engineer, despite being in constant pain from his burn scars. The moment when 380 men, who'd been taught that surrender was worse than death, chose to save the lives of men who'd been taught to hate them. It also didn't mention the photograph that the Missoula Sentinel didn't publish, taken by a guard who carried a personal camera. Japanese prisoners and American guards standing together in front of the saved camp, all of them exhausted, filthy, and united by something that transcended nationality. The image existed, but never saw print. In August 1944, the idea of American guards and Japanese prisoners working together, let alone appearing together in a photograph suggesting cooperation, was too controversial. The picture was filed away, lost to history. James Mitchell returned to Ohio in 1946, married his sweetheart Ruth, took over his family's hardware store. He rarely spoke about his war service. When asked about the Pacific, he'd mention Guadalcanal, the wound, the Purple Heart. He never mentioned Camp Riverside or the night he'd convinced his commander to arm 380 Japanese prisoners. But he kept a piece of charred wood from the firebreak. It sat on his desk at the hardware store for 46 years, unlabeled. When customers asked about it, he'd say, "Souvenir from Montana. Reminder that people are more complicated than we think." Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1946 to find Hiroshima, his hometown, destroyed by atomic bomb. His wife and 2 daughters had died in the blast. His home, his school, his entire world was ash. He emigrated to Brazil in 1948, joined a Japanese farming community there, taught school to children of immigrants. He never spoke about his POW experience, except to say he'd been treated fairly by Americans. When pressed, he'd add, "I learned that enemies are temporary, courage is permanent, and sometimes the people who should hate you most are the ones who save you." Private Taro Nakamura returned to his farming village to find it untouched by war, but changed by peace. He used his saved POW wages, 80 cents a day for 22 months, to buy English language books, and eventually became a translator. He never forgot the night he'd asked, "What do if fire comes?" and learned that sometimes the answer is stand and fight together. Corporal Hideo Tanaka, the combat engineer, returned to a Japan that needed rebuilding. He spent 40 years reconstructing infrastructure, bridges, roads, buildings. He never built fortifications again. When asked about his burn scars, he'd say, "Old injury from the war," but never specify which part. The burns from combat on Tarawa, or the burns from fighting an American wildfire while a prisoner in Montana, they'd healed together into a single scar. Camp Riverside closed in October 1945 after Japan's surrender. The facility was sold, converted to civilian use, eventually demolished in the 1960s. Nothing remains of the original buildings, except for one thing. In 2004, a Montana Historical Society researcher found the unpublished photograph in a box of donated materials. It showed American guards and Asian men in work clothes, standing together near burned forest. On the back, in faded pencil, Camp Riverside Fire Crew, August 18, 1944. The researcher initially assumed they were Chinese laborers. Only after extensive investigation, cross-referencing fire reports, military records, and camp documentation, did the truth emerge. These were Japanese prisoners of war who'd fought a wildfire to save an American military facility. The story was published in a scholarly journal in 2006. It received minimal attention. By then, most of the participants were dead. The narrative didn't fit comfortable categories. Too complex for heroism, too cooperative for stories of wartime hatred, too obscure for popular history. But in 2015, the great-grandson of Private Nakamura visited Montana while researching his family history. He found the photo in the Historical Society archives and recognized his great-grandfather from family pictures. The youngest man in the lineup, standing slightly apart, his face serious. The family had known Taro had been a POW in America. They hadn't known about the fire. The great-grandson donated Taro's personal effects to the Historical Society. His pocket dictionary, worn from use. His POW identification card. a small piece of charred wood wrapped in cloth, with a note in Japanese. From the night we chose to be useful. The items are displayed now in a small exhibit at the Montana Historical Society Museum. Most visitors pass it without noticing. It's not dramatic, just everyday objects from a forgotten moment. But the caption tells the story. August 1944. When forest fire threatened Camp Riverside POW facility, Japanese prisoners and American guards worked together to save it. All 380 prisoners remained to fight the fire. None escaped. All survived. The exhibit ends with a quote from James Mitchell, given in a rare interview in 1998, 2 years before his death. People ask if I was scared they'd turn on us. Of course I was scared. But I was also scared of burning to death, and they were my only option. Turns out fear makes strange choices, and sometimes the strangest choices turn out to be the right ones. Those men, those Japanese prisoners, they didn't just save the camp. They saved something bigger. They proved that even in war, even between enemies, there's still a line we won't cross. A choice we can make to be human instead of just soldiers. I've spent 60 years being grateful we made that choice. He died in 2000 at age 79. Among his personal effects, the charred wood from the firebreak and a letter written in careful English, dated 1987, from Brazil. Dear Corporal Mitchell, I do not know if you remember me. I was Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto, prisoner at Camp Riverside. I think of that night often. The night you trusted us when you had no reason. The night we worked together against common enemy, not each other, but the fire. Thank you for seeing us as men instead of just Japanese. Thank you for giving us chance to be useful. Thank you for believing better of us than we believed of ourselves. With respect and gratitude, Kenji Yamamoto. Mitchell had never responded. He'd told his family he didn't know what to say, how to bridge that gap of history and language and experience. But he'd kept the letter, carried it in his wallet for 13 years, until he died. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in silence. Sometimes the most meaningful connections are the ones we can't quite find words for. And sometimes, in the darkness of a Montana night, with fire coming and time running out, enemies become something else. Not quite friends, but not enemies anymore either. Just men working together, choosing to save each other, proving that humanity can survive even war.